So we have found our root. The only problem now is that the offset values that we have for it, if you look at the materials I've provided, are actually for each individual root entry. It doesn't tell you how to look through the whole root directory because that could contain anything. It could start anywhere. But one thing you will notice is that anything that's been unallocated begins with the value E5, and you're seeing that over and over right here, every 2 rows, starting with the 3rd row into it. And if you look at this is actually a volume label. We know that this is the name of the volume that we downloaded if you were paying attention when you got it from the NIST website earlier. And to be honest, I don't know what these values are, but I don't really need to because I can see that the files all began right about here, and if you look at the text, the bit of ASCII that we can get, that seems to add up pretty well. The only one that doesn't start with E5 is app.txt right here, and that adds up as well because that was our only allocated file when we were looking through it with the help of FTK's file parsing. So we'll take a look at app.txt first because it will be the simplest to parse because it's just an ordinary file with nothing wrong with it. So if you look at our charts, there are actually two sets of values, two values that tell you how to find the file itself based on the root. And that is at offset 20 to 21, you have the high bits, and in 26 to 27, you have the low bits. I'm not exactly sure why they're split up, probably just to make it more difficult for you. But you can also see that it says that this is a cluster address, so remember that for when we go to find it, because you're not using sectors anymore at this point, you're using clusters, which are sets of 2 sectors. Anyways, if I haven't confused you enough yet, we will look for those values, offset 20 to 21. If this is the start of our entry here, then we know that this is offset 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21. Both just 0. So obviously it's not that deep into it because there are no high values set. Then we look for the low bits, so that would be 22, 23, 24, 25, and, 26 and 27. We've got 0200. So that, because it says high bits and low bits, we're going to end up putting those together to give us, these two would come first in Little Indian order, which is what you typically use. So it's 0000 and then 0020. And that comes out in decimal form to be 512 again. Problem is that this is actually Big Indian. So once again, if you were to follow this number like I did at first, it will lead you astray. The address is actually just going to be flipped around within this value, and it's just going to be 2. 2 is the address of the cluster at which app.txt is located. The thing about these addresses, if you read through the material, is that the first entry is actually numbered as address number 2. So that means that app.txt is actually the very first entry after the root here. So we need to find the end of this root if we're going to find app.txt, because that's where it'll begin. So there is a value that'll help us that's back in the boot sector. I'm not going to go back and show you, but it's offset 17 and 18, and those come out to 528 in decimal, and that is the maximum number of entries that the boot sector can contain, that the root can contain, sorry. So, the root can contain 528 entries. And if we look at this, an entry is 32 bytes long. You can just see that by looking at all of these entries. Each one takes up 2 rows. A row is 16 bytes. So we have 32 bytes per entry times 528 entries. That gets us 16,896, and that is how long this root is going to be, because you can only fit as many as you have space for. That's what it means by maximum. So this time we're going to go to offset, but we're going to start from our current position because I clicked at the beginning of the root here just to make it a little bit easier, a little bit less math. We'll copy in this value that we just calculated, still decimal, from current position, okay, and hey, we found appetizers. How about that? And if you're not really following and this seems difficult, don't worry, I messed this up many times along the way before I learned which ones are big and little Indian and which values really mean what. This is really a huge pain to do yourself. So just keep following along and learning. It's not a big deal if you don't do all the math along the way.
All right, so now that we've done a more standard allocated text entry, let's take a look at just what we have as the first entry here, and that'll be these first 2 rows into the root. You can see that the name gets a little bit weird and that this file extension is not where you would expect it to be based on these other ones like app.txt. The reason for that is that this is actually called an LFN entry, which stands for long file name. These exist for any entries that have more than 11 characters to their name. That's what FAT directory entries are limited to. So in order to store the full name of it, it creates these, and they have a little checksum number in them that lets the system correspond them to the shorter file name entries. These are actually in Unicode, and you can see based on what I've provided that the file name characters are in offsets 1 through 10, 14 to 25, and 28 to 31. They're actually split up into 3 places. Gotta love the fat file system, right? So we pull, that's 7, 8, 9, 10. Those are the first 10 hex bytes there. And then we pull our 14 to 25, so 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. Okay, and I happen to know that it only takes up those 2 spots. The third space for the file name is just empty in this case. So we will head back over to CyberChef. We paste this in, which I've already done here. But look, the output is just a bunch of, I'm going to say Chinese characters, and they don't make any sense to me at least. And that's because Windows in these entries doesn't encode them as UTF-BE like the file names and everything else were. In these entries, they are UTF-LE. And we bake that. And there we go. Zakuski.txt. That means appetizers in Russian. So that is actually the long file name entry you would imagine for app.txt, right? It makes sense. It's the appetizers section. So we go back and try to find the corresponding directory entry just to make sure. But as it turns out, that is absolutely fiendishly complicated. That hash I mentioned earlier that correlates the two, it That is very, very difficult to calculate. I wouldn't recommend ever trying. Luckily, there is a much easier method. The directory entries, which is the non-LFN ones, by the way, not just folders. I'm just using that word. Those are in the opposite order of the LFN entries. So this is the first LFN entry, meaning it will most likely correspond to the last directory entry. And what do you know? app.txt, Zakuski, which translates into appetizers. Okay, we are now going to look at entry number 2. Now, this one is not an LFN entry, even though it has kind of a wonky name, but it does resemble those temporary files that if you have hidden files set to show up in Windows, you'll often see when, say, you open a Word document. They'll show up in the same directory for a minute while it's open, with the tilde towards the end of the name. So why don't we go ahead and look at the file attributes, which if you look at your chart for these directory entries is at offset number 11. So entry number 2, go to offset 8, 9, 10, 11, and that is 20. That is a hex number. We have another table that tells us what each of these values mean, and 20 means that it's an archive. Now, because this is a value that's only 1 byte long, and a byte translates into 2 groups of 4 bits, it's possible that those 2 bits are flipped, that this is big Indian and the chart is little Indian. I'm actually not sure. So if that's the case, it would be 02, indicating a hidden file. That sounds a little bit more right to me if this is in fact a temporary file, but we're kind of making guesses at this point as to what this actually is. So let's just keep going. If we look at offsets 26 and 27, so let's just count backwards from the end here, 32, 31, 30, 29, 28, 27, and 26. We've got this value here, 3102 in hex, and that is going to point us to, all right, so let's count backwards here, 31, 30, 29, 28, 27, and 26 are right here. And you can see we have the value 0200. Again, this is going to be big Indian, so if we flip it, it is just the number 2, and that is the cluster address. So cluster 2, sound familiar? That is actually where app.txt was, which indicates that this is probably a temporary file for app.txt.
Alright, next up we have entry number 3, and we can see, taking a look at it, we've got this E5 value for the first bit. That means it's unallocated, and if you start looking at the various values in it, you will soon find that this is in fact an LFN entry. So let's get the name the same way we did before, by taking the offset 1 through 10 values, followed by 14 through 25, so 12, 13, 14. There we have that. Then we can head back to CyberChef here, paste in these values, and looks like I don't have to put it up anymore. So it should be LE, and there we have it, napipki.txt. That translates to drinks. So, this being the second LFN entry, the second from the last directory entry, which is entry 4, should correspond to this one. So let's head on to entry 4 and see about that. First thing we see is that it is also unallocated, so that tracks that both of them would be. We've got our name here, which is one that we saw before in the root folder, and it's following the same sort of format as entry number 2, which we thought to be maybe a temp file. Next, we look at the cluster address, which is in offsets 26 to 27. So we've got 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. There it is, 26 and 27. And if you remember, that was big endian, so these get reversed if we want to look at it as little endian. So it's just the number 3, whether hex or decimal, 3 is the same. So we have the address of cluster 2 from before, the offset. And we know that a cluster is 1024 bytes. So all we got to do is add those together to find our offset for this. And there's our new number. Copy that, and we will try going to that offset, and it's decimal, and it's from the beginning of the file. And what do you know? It's the beverages section. So that confirms that entry 3 is the LFN entry for entry 4, which is the beverages section. Seems to be a temp file. And that is the last of my tutorial here. Next walkthrough is going to be the hacking case in the NIST images challenges that you can look at. That one is a lot more of actual forensics. This one is really more of a warm-up, shows you how to import these images, how to search within them. Next time we'll be using a lot more of registry, artifacts, MRU lists, shell bags, all those nice things that you can learn about, and I'll give you more resources on it as well.